The helicopter came in low and fast, kicking up a curtain of pale dust that swept across the motor pool and sent two privates scrambling for their covers. It wasn't a resupply bird. Wrong markings, wrong time of day. The men working the flight line shielded their eyes and watched it settle onto the pad with the kind of indifference that came from months of routine at Forward Operating Base Kestrel, a place so far from anything that even boredom had grown boring. The door slid open before the rotors fully wound down. One person stepped out. She was carrying a single rucksack, a hard-sided rifle case, and nothing else. No escort, no welcome party. She walked across the pad with her head slightly down against the dust, her uniform clean but worn at the elbows in the way that came from field time, not laundry problems. She looked young, mid-20s at most, small-framed. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly under her patrol cap. She moved without urgency, without performance, without any apparent awareness that half the flight line had stopped to stare at her. Staff Sergeant Daniel Briggs was leaning against the hood of a MRAP when she approached the check-in desk outside the operations building. He was 34, broad across the shoulders, with the particular brand of confidence that grew on men who had been good at their jobs long enough to forget what it felt like not to be. He watched her sign in, watched the duty clerk look at the transfer papers, then look at her, then look at the papers again. Briggs pushed off the hood and walked over. "Vasquez?" he said, reading her name tape before she could answer. "Yes, Staff Sergeant. Elena Vasquez. Transferred from 2nd Ranger Battalion, ISR attachment." He said it the way someone reads a punchline before they've decided if it's funny. "You're my new sniper element." "That's what the orders say." He looked at the rifle case, then at her, then back at the case, as if he were trying to work out a math problem that wasn't adding up. "You ate yet?" "No. Chow hall's behind the motor pool. Find your bunk first. Corporal Davis will show you." He paused. "We run quals tomorrow, 0600. Don't be late." He walked away without another word. Corporal Marcus Davis was 22 and had the decency to at least pretend he wasn't curious. He led her across the gravel path between the prefab buildings without peppering her with questions, which she seemed to appreciate. He showed her the bunk room she'd been assigned, a 6-person room with 5 existing occupants, all male, which told her immediately how the assignment request had been handled. One bunk had been cleared in the corner, the mattress still bare. Someone had left a permanent marker drawing on the wall above it, a stick figure, falling. Davis saw her looking at it. "I can get someone to paint over that," he said. "Don't bother." She set her ruck on the mattress and placed the rifle case on the floor beside it, flat, with the handle facing outward. Not locked away, not stowed under the bunk, right where she could reach it. Davis left. She sat on the bare mattress and looked at the drawing on the wall for a moment. Then she opened the rifle case, removed the weapon, a heavily modified MK-21 PSR, fitted with a suppressor she'd brought separately, with turret adjustments that didn't match any standard base-issue configuration, and began to break it down. Not to clean it. It was already clean. She broke it down and rebuilt it the way some people pace, methodically, without thinking about it. By dinner, the story had already moved through the base the way stories do in enclosed places. Faster than truth, slower than rumor, and already partially wrong. What people said, she was the only survivor from an overseas mission that went bad. Her whole team was gone. She'd been pulled out and transferred quietly because command didn't know what else to do with her. What people added, without any real information to support it. She froze. When it mattered, she froze, and her team paid for it. Nobody said this to her face. They said it at tables when she walked past in the chow hall with her tray, sitting alone at the far end without seeming to notice or mind. A few men glanced over. One made a comment under his breath that drew a low laugh. She ate without looking up. The only man who didn't participate in any of it was Master Sergeant Raymond Holloway. Holloway was the senior NCO on base, 51 years old, with a face like dry riverbed, and 28 years of service that he never talked about. He had the kind of stillness that made younger soldiers nervous without knowing why. The stillness of someone who had already been through every version of the situation they were currently in, and found most of them less interesting than they appeared. He was sitting at a table near the far wall with a cup of coffee and a logbook, not eating, when Elena came through the door. He watched her move through the line, watched her choose the far table, watched the group of men near the center make their comment, and then he watched her, not her reaction, because there wasn't one, but her hands. The way she set her fork down between bites with the same spacing every time, the way her eyes, while aimed at the table, tracked the room in slow, regular intervals. He didn't say anything. He went back to his logbook, but he didn't write anything in it for the next several minutes. That night, in the bunk room, one of the other occupants, a specialist named Garrett, waited until lights were mostly out before speaking into the dark. "Hey, Vasquez." Silence. "They're saying you were the only one who made it back from your last post. That true?" A pause, long enough that Garrett assumed she was either asleep or ignoring him. "Get some sleep," she said finally. "Quals are at 0600. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. In the dark, she stared at the stick figure someone had drawn on the wall above her bunk. Falling. She'd seen worse jokes. She'd been in worse rooms. She pulled the thin blanket up and closed her eyes. The rifle case was on the floor beside her, handle facing out. She was asleep in under 4 minutes. The qualification range at FOB Kestrel was a stripped-down affair, a flat stretch of compacted dirt running 600 meters to a berm, with steel targets at 200, 400, and 600 meters. Standard distances. The kind of range built for confirmation, not challenge. A place to check boxes, not test limits. Briggs had the whole sniper element out by 0550. 4 men plus Vasquez. The morning was cold in the particular way desert mornings are cold. Aggressively, temporarily, as if the heat were waiting just behind a curtain. The men moved around the firing line with the easy familiarity of a group that had been operating together long enough to have their own rhythms. They knew who took which lane. They knew whose gear to leave alone. They had a shorthand built from shared time, shared missions, shared complaints. Elena Vasquez stood slightly apart from that, not by anyone's direction, just by the natural geometry of groups that weren't ready to absorb someone new. She set her case down at the far left lane, opened it, and began assembling her rifle with the same quiet efficiency she'd used the night before. No rush, no theatrics. The MK-21 came together in her hands the way familiar things do, without requiring her full attention. Specialist Garrett, assigned to the lane beside her, watched from the corner of his eye. "You bring your own glass?" he asked, nodding at the scope. "Yes." "What is that?" "A Tremor 3. Modified." He waited for more. She didn't offer any. He looked at the turret housing, at the parallax adjustment that was set well beyond what 600 meters would require, and opened his mouth to say something else. Then he thought better of it and turned back to his own rifle. Briggs walked the line with his hands in his jacket pockets, stopping behind each shooter for a few seconds before moving on. When he reached Elena's lane, he stopped longer. "Vasquez, 600 meters, 5 rounds, all targets. You'll go last." "Understood. This is a baseline qual. Not a competition. Just show me you can hit what you're supposed to hit." There was something in the phrasing, "supposed to hit," that carried a passenger, like he'd already drawn a conclusion and the range was just the paperwork. She didn't respond. She prone-positioned behind the rifle and waited. The other 4 went first. They were good. Not exceptional, but consistently good in the way trained soldiers become. Technical, reliable, without wasted movement. Garrett put 5 rounds in a tight group at 600 that drew a nod from Briggs. A sergeant named Okafor ran the targets clean in under 40 seconds. By the time the last man finished, the mood on the line had settled into the comfortable confidence of a group that knew what they were doing. Then it was Elena's turn. She fired slowly. That was the first thing everyone noticed. Not carefully. Slowly. There was a difference, and most of the men on that line were experienced enough to sense it, even if they couldn't name it. She took her time between rounds in a way that didn't look like hesitation, but didn't look like confidence either. It looked like something else that none of them had a ready word for. She hit every target, all 5 rounds, every distance, but she didn't post a group at 600 that made anyone blink. Center mass, consistent, nothing remarkable. Briggs looked at the target feedback on the range tablet and said nothing for a moment. "Clean," he said finally. "But your split times are slow. In a real situation, that gets people killed." "Yes, Staff Sergeant." "You trained as a precision shooter or a DMR?" "Precision? Then you should know that precision doesn't mean slow. It means accurate and fast." He said it to her, but his volume was calibrated for the men behind him. A few of them looked at the dirt or their rifles. Garrett watched Elena's face. She had the expression of someone listening to information they already had. "We'll run it again next week," Briggs said, already moving away. "See if you can pick up the pace." He didn't say she'd failed. Technically, she hadn't. But the tone carried its own verdict, and by the time they were walking back from the range, that verdict had started circulating. The nickname appeared by lunch. Nobody claimed ownership of it, which was how these things always worked. It surfaced at a table in the chow hall, passed between men who thought it was more clever than cruel, and by mid-afternoon had reached enough ears to become semi-official in the way base nicknames did. Never written down, never announced, simply suddenly existing. They called her Ghost Crew, because her crew were ghosts, because she was all that came back. The implication sat underneath the name like something unpleasant under a rock, and most of the men who used it didn't examine it too closely. It was easier not to. Elena heard it within hours. She gave no indication that she did. What she did instead was return to the range alone at 1600, when it was unoccupied, with her rifle and a notebook. She didn't use the standard targets. She set up her own, small, hand-cut squares of paper fixed to wooden stakes at intervals. She measured herself. Using a laser rangefinder she pulled from her kit. The distances she marked in the notebook were not 600 meters. Private First Class Delgado, pulling perimeter duty on the eastern wall, saw her out there from his position and watched for a while, unable to make sense of the distances she was shooting at. He mentioned it to Garrett that evening. "How far out was she shooting?" Garrett asked. Delgado thought about it. "Had to be past 800, maybe more. I couldn't even see the targets she was using." Garrett filed that somewhere in the back of his mind and didn't mention it to anyone else. Master Sergeant Holloway had a habit of reviewing transfer documentation personally for anyone assigned to units under his NCO oversight. It was a practice he developed 20 years ago and maintained without exception. Usually it took 10 minutes, service record, deployment history, commendations, disciplinary flags. Straightforward. He pulled Elena Vasquez's file at 1800. He was still reading at 1900. At some point he stopped reading and simply sat with the file open in front of him, his coffee going cold on the edge of the desk. There were sections with standard black redaction bars, not unusual for ISR-attached personnel with overseas operational history. There were commendation entries that were listed by date without description, which was also not unusual, but the frequency of them was. What was unusual, what made Holloway set the file flat on the desk and look at the wall for a moment, was a single entry near the back. A verified record from her previous unit, attached as a supplementary document. It wasn't redacted. It was written in the flat bureaucratic language that the military used for things it didn't want to dramatize, which only made it more striking to anyone who knew how to read it. He closed the file, locked it in the lower drawer of his desk. Then he sat there for another few minutes in the quiet of his office, and when he finally stood up and turned off the desk lamp, his expression was the one he got when he was recalibrating something, when the information he'd just received required him to quietly revise a conclusion he hadn't realized he'd already made. He walked across the base toward the operations building. Stopped once when he passed the eastern range and heard, faintly, the distant sound of a single shot. Then silence. Then another. He looked out in that direction for a moment, though there was nothing to see in the dark. Then he went inside. In the bunk room that night, the nickname came up again, this time from someone who hadn't bothered to lower his voice enough or hadn't cared to. The words hung in the air briefly before the room went quiet, with the particular quiet of people waiting to see what happened next. What happened was nothing. Elena's breathing from the corner bunk remained steady and slow. If she was awake, she gave nothing away. If she was asleep, the sound hadn't reached her. Garrett stared at the ceiling for a long time after that. The rifle case was on the floor beside her bunk. Same position as the night before, handle facing out. He'd been in the Army long enough to know that the way a person kept their weapon said something about them. Most soldiers stowed their rifles, locked them away, put distance between themselves and the tool because distance was how you rested. Some people kept them close because they'd learned, somewhere and at some cost, that distance was a luxury. He thought about what Delgado had said. 800 meters. Maybe more. Targets too small to see. He didn't sleep well. The mission briefing for the recon element went up on the board at 0700 on a Tuesday, 3 days after Elena's arrival at FOB Kestrel. 4 men. A 40-kilometer push into a stretch of high desert terrain that intelligence had flagged as a possible resupply corridor for a regional armed group that had been moving materiel through the area for the better part of 6 weeks. The objective was observation only. Establish a hide, document movement, extract clean. No engagement unless fired upon. 48 hours out, 48 hours back. Briggs led it personally. He took Okafor, Garrett, and a sergeant named Pulaski, who was quiet and competent, and had been on 3 similar missions in the last 4 months without incident. Elena's name was not on the roster. She saw the board when she came through the operations building for the morning briefing. She stood in front of it for a moment, reading the names, then walked to her seat and sat down without comment. Briggs noticed her reading it. He didn't say anything either. The briefing lasted 40 minutes. Routes, rally points, communication windows, contingency protocols. Standard architecture for a standard mission. Briggs ran it with the efficiency of someone who had done this enough times that the structure had become automatic, not careless, just worn smooth by repetition. When it was over, he stopped briefly near the door and addressed the room generally, though the direction of his words was not difficult to determine. Perimeter watch rotation stays as is while we're out. Vasquez, you're on the 0200 to 0600 shift for both nights. It was the least desirable shift. The coldest hours. The ones that accumulated fatigue without offering anything in return. Yes, Staff Sergeant, she said. He left. Garrett caught her eye briefly on his way out. She was already looking back at the mission board. He couldn't read her expression, which he was beginning to understand was a consistent feature of her face, rather than an occasional one. The recon element departed at 1400 in 2 vehicles, moving light. The base settled into the particular rhythm of a forward operating base with its primary team in the field. Slightly tighter, slightly quieter, the way a house feels when someone important has left it. The duty officer, Lieutenant Ferris, was 26 and technically in charge during Briggs's absence, a fact he handled by staying close to the operations desk and deferring to Holloway on anything that required actual judgment. Holloway, for his part, moved through the base at his usual pace. He stopped by the armory in the afternoon, checked the vehicle maintenance log, reviewed the communication schedule. At one point he paused outside the operations building and looked out toward the eastern range, where Elena was running drills, dry fire exercises, position transitions, the kind of repetitive physical work that looked like punishment from the outside, but was actually the opposite. He watched for a moment. Then he went inside. The first communication window came at 2200 the first night. Briggs's element checked in clean. Position established, no contact, observation underway. Lieutenant Ferris logged it and relayed confirmation. Everything was running exactly as it was supposed to run. The second window was scheduled for 0600 the following morning. It produced nothing. Ferris tried the primary frequency 3 times, then the backup. Static. He looked at the communication log as if it might offer an explanation, then looked at the duty sergeant, then walked quickly to Holloway's quarters. Holloway was already awake when Ferris knocked. He opened the door in his uniform, boots on, which meant he hadn't slept much, and listened to Ferris's report without interrupting. "How long past window?" Holloway asked. 18 minutes. "Try the emergency frequency." "Already did. Nothing." Holloway looked at the floor for a second, the way he did when he was moving through a decision quickly. "Get the drone up. I want eyes on their last confirmed position." "Sir, command protocol says we wait another—" "I know what the protocol says, Lieutenant. Get the drone up." Ferris went. Holloway pulled on his jacket and walked to the operations building. The drone feed came up at 0641. What it showed made the operations room go very quiet, very fast. The 2 vehicles were still at the observation point. One of them was on its side. The ground around them showed the thermal signatures of recent fire. 4 human-sized heat signatures were clustered behind the overturned vehicle, and a rock formation roughly 30 meters to its north, pinned in a shallow depression that offered cover in only 2 directions. 3 separate positions in the surrounding terrain showed additional signatures. Armed, not moving toward the pinned element, but not withdrawing either. Holding, waiting. "They've been there a while," the drone operator said quietly, reading the ground temperature differential. "Could be 6 hours, maybe more." The operations room absorbed this. Holloway studied the feed. The terrain around the pinned element was bad. Open approach from 3 sides, the 4th blocked by a ridgeline that ran roughly northeast to southwest about 1.5 kilometers from the position. The enemy elements were using the high ground intelligently, positioned so that any extraction attempt from the base's direction would be visible and exposed long before it reached the team. "QRF is 40 minutes out minimum," Ferris said, his voice controlled but tight. "And that's if we move right now. Through that approach, they'll see us coming for 20 minutes before we get there." "I know," Holloway said. "So what do we—" He stopped, because Holloway had turned from the screen and was looking through the operations building window toward the armory. Elena had watched the drone feed go up from a position near the back of the operations room. Nobody had told her to come. She had been ending her 0200 to 0600 shift when the communication failure became apparent, and she had simply not left. She stood near the back wall with her arms at her sides and read the terrain on the screen with the focused, unhurried attention of someone doing a calculation. When Ferris began talking about the QRF timeline, she was already doing the math on something else. She looked at the ridgeline on the feed. Northeast to southwest, high ground. She looked at the distance marker in the corner of the drone display. She looked at where Briggs and his men were pinned. She looked at the enemy positions. Her expression didn't change, but she pushed off the wall. She walked to the armory without announcing herself. The duty armorer was already awake given the situation, and he looked up when she came in. "I need to check out my rifle," she said. "Ma'am, nobody's been authorized for—" "Check it out under my name," she said. "I'll sign for it." He looked at her for a second, looked at the operations building, looked back at her. She waited. He pulled the log. Holloway was still looking out the window when he saw her come out of the armory with her rifle case and a smaller bag, her personal kit, which he recognized she must have pre-staged at some point, because it came out of the armory too fast to have been assembled just now. She moved across the gravel path toward the northern perimeter at a pace that was not a run but covered ground quickly. Ferris was talking behind him, something about command authorization, about the QRF coordination, about the communication blackout. Holloway let him talk. He watched Elena reach the northern perimeter wire, exchange 4 words with the gate guard, and pass through. She angled immediately toward the ridgeline that ran northeast to southwest behind the base, the high ground that backed up against the observation point terrain 40 kilometers out. Holloway did the mental geometry of that ridgeline extension. He had walked that terrain personally, twice, in his first month at Kestrel. He knew where it peaked. He knew what you could see from the top of it on a clear morning. He stood very still for a moment. Then he picked up the radio handset from the operations desk, switched to the drone operator's frequency, and said, "Keep the bird on the pinned element. But I want a secondary camera on the ridgeline northwest of their position, the high point. Put eyes on it and keep them there." Ferris stopped talking. "Master Sergeant, who are you?" "Coordinate the QRF," Holloway said, handing him the main radio. "Get them moving, but tell them to hold at the staging point until I say otherwise." "Why?" Holloway looked out the window again, in the direction Elena had gone. She was already past the wire, already small against the pale scrub of the hillside, moving upward without hesitation. "Because I read her file," he said. He didn't explain further. He pulled a chair to the drone feed monitor and sat down. And he waited. The ridgeline was not a kind climb. It rose at an angle that punished the legs quickly and offered nothing in return. No shade, no flat sections to recover on. No clear path through the loose shale that shifted underfoot and sent small cascades of rock skittering downhill with every third step. The scrub brush was dry and brittle, and grabbed at gear without slowing anything. The wind came off the upper elevation in irregular pulses, cold and gritty, carrying the fine dust that got into everything out here. Elena climbed without stopping. She moved the way people move when they have done something so many times that the discomfort has been fully absorbed into the action. Not ignored, not suppressed, simply incorporated. Her breathing was controlled and nasal despite the grade. Her rifle case was slung diagonally across her back, the smaller kit across her front, and she kept her center of gravity low on the steeper sections without thinking about it. Her eyes were on the ridge above her, not the ground in front of her feet, which was either a sign of significant experience or dangerous overconfidence, depending on who was watching. She reached the upper shelf, a long tilted table of exposed rock maybe 4 meters wide, 41 minutes after leaving the wire. She didn't stop to appreciate the elevation or the view. She went flat immediately, rolling into a prone position at the forward edge where the rock gave way to a 2-meter drop and then open terrain beyond, and she began glassing the valley below with her rangefinder before her breathing had fully settled. It took her 90 seconds to find them. Through the rangefinder, the overturned vehicle was a dark shape against pale ground, sitting at a slight angle like something discarded. She could see the second vehicle partially behind a rock formation, intact, but angled badly, probably axle deep in the loose soil that looked solid until it wasn't. The heat signatures the drone had shown translated in daylight to 4 men in a shallow depression between the vehicles and the rocks, using both for cover, pressed low. She could see Briggs. He was on the left edge of the depression, facing northwest, rifle up. Even at this distance, through the rangefinder, his posture read as someone who had been in the same position for a long time and was running the math on how much longer it could continue. She shifted to the enemy positions. First position, 2 men, northeast of the pinned team, using a broken rock shelf about 1 meter high. Good cover from the team's direction, completely open from elevation. Second position, 1 man, further northeast, higher ground, likely the one coordinating, partially behind a vehicle of their own, a truck with the hood up, which might have been a breakdown or might have been deliberate staging. Third position, 2 men, southeast, in a dry creek bed that gave them a natural trench, the most protected of the 3, the most difficult angle. She set the rangefinder down and opened her notebook, wrote the positions in a shorthand that would have been illegible to anyone else. Angles, estimated elevations, cover profiles. Then she pulled the rangefinder back up and began measuring distances with the methodical patience of someone building a structure that had to hold weight. The numbers came back in sequence. First position, 1,840 meters. Second position, 2,060 meters. Third position, 2,100 meters. She wrote them down, looked at them for a moment, looked back through the rangefinder at the third position, the creek bed, the 2 men, The angle. The most protected. The most dangerous to the team if the QRF tried to come in from the west. If those two men in the creek bed held their position, any extraction vehicle would drive into a clean cross angle with no cover for the last 400 meters of approach. They had to go first. She set the rangefinder aside and opened her rifle case. The assembly was different this time. Not the range exercise, not the qualification shoot. She worked through it with a completeness that the earlier versions hadn't required. Suppressor seated and torqued, turrets uncapped and set to 0, then adjusted in sequence as she pulled the notebook back and began running the actual firing solution. The math for 2,100 meters in these conditions was not simple. It involved the wind, which was moving in two distinct layers. The surface layer here on the ridge was northeast at roughly 12 kilometers per hour, but the valley below had a different exposure, more open, probably shifting. It involved the temperature differential between the ridge elevation and the valley floor. It involved the angle of the shot. She was shooting downhill, which shortened the effective gravity component and required a hold adjustment that most shooters at this distance got wrong until they had been wrong about it once, at a cost they didn't forget. She had been wrong about it once. She hadn't forgotten. The load she was using was match grade, hand-prepared, not base issue. She'd brought her own. The base armorer had looked at the ammunition when she'd checked out the rifle and hadn't said anything, which was the right call. She built the solution in the notebook. Then she set the turrets. Then she looked through the scope for the first time. At full magnification, the creek bed swam briefly as she settled, then clarified. She could see the two men clearly enough to read posture. One was watching the pin team's position through his own optic. The other was on a radio. She found her and stabilized, controlled her breathing down to the slow, even rhythm that dropped her heart rate by feel rather than by count. She felt the wind on the left side of her face shift slightly, recalculate, and settle. She adjusted 2 clicks on the windage turret without lifting her cheek from the stock. She waited for the natural respiratory pause, the brief stillness between exhale and inhale where the body is temporarily in equilibrium, and the rifle becomes, for a fraction of a second, completely motionless. She broke the shot. In the operations building at FOB Kestrel, the secondary drone camera had been sitting on the ridgeline high point for 22 minutes, showing nothing but empty rock, when the image registered a human shape at the forward edge. Prone, flat against the stone, almost invisible against the color of it. The drone operator leaned forward. "I've got someone on the ridge," he said. Holloway didn't look up from the primary feed, which was still showing the pinned element and the 3 enemy positions. "I know," he said. "Watch the creek bed." "Which?" "The southeast position." "Yes." The operator switched the primary camera angle slightly to bring the creek bed into better frame. 4 seconds later, one of the 2 signatures in the creek bed dropped. The operator said nothing for a moment. The room was very quiet. Then, 8 seconds after the first shot, the second signature in the creek bed dropped. "That's," the operator started. "Watch the northeast position," Holloway said. His voice was the same as it always was, level, unhurried, as if he were reading from the logbook. The camera panned. The northeast position, 2 men behind the broken rock shelf, had already registered the shots. One of them was moving, repositioning, trying to find the angle. He was looking the wrong direction entirely, scanning the low terrain to the west where a conventional shooter would have been. He was still looking west when the third shot came. The second man in the northeast position, who had not moved, went down 11 seconds after his partner. 3 shots, 3 targets, 4 men neutralized. Elapsed time from first to last, 41 seconds. The room had the particular quality of silence that follows something that requires a moment to be fully believed. At the primary feed, the coordinating position, the single man behind the truck with the hood up, was already moving. Running northeast, away from the engagement, abandoning the position, leaving his truck, moving fast. On the pin team's feed, something changed. Briggs had lifted his head. His posture had shifted from the compressed stillness of someone under sustained threat to something more upright, more mobile. He was looking at the creek bed, then at the northeast position, then, and the camera wasn't high resolution enough to confirm this, but Holloway believed it, upward, toward the ridgeline. QRF, Holloway said to Ferris, without turning from the screen. Send them now. Route them east of the standard approach. They'll have a clean corridor. Ferris was already on the radio. On the secondary camera feed, the ridgeline high point showed the prone figure remaining flat and still, not moving, not rising, already glassing the valley again, already checking. Holloway looked at that image for a long moment. A young woman on a rock shelf, a mile and a half above the problem she had just solved, alone, in the wind, doing the thing she had clearly always been able to do. He picked up the radio handset, switched to the ridge frequency. Vasquez, he said. A pause. Master Sergeant. Her voice through the radio was even and controlled, slightly wind-affected but clear. Team is moving to extract. QRF is on the way. Copy. You need anything up there? A brief silence. No. He set the handset down. Looked back at the screen. Master Sergeant, the drone operator said quietly, without looking away from his display. What's the verified range on that third position? Holloway had already measured it from the drone's positional data when the shooting started. He looked at the number he'd written on the notepad beside the monitor. 2,114 meters, he said. The operator didn't respond. He just kept watching the screen. In the creek bed on the primary feed, the extraction corridor was already opening up. The QRF vehicles were on the move. Briggs's element was rising from the depression, moving toward the second vehicle, covering angles out of muscle memory. On the secondary feed, the ridgeline was still and quiet. Elena Vasquez lay flat against the rock, her scope still on the valley below, her breathing slow. The wind moved across the ridge in its irregular pulses. She was not finished watching until the last man was in the vehicle. That was the part that most people skipped, the part that felt like it was already over. She had learned, at significant cost, that it was never over until the last man was in the vehicle. She watched until he was. The QRF vehicles came back through the gate at 1347. Briggs was in the second vehicle, passenger side, which meant he'd given up the front of the lead truck, the command position, to Okafor, who had a cut above his left eye that had been field-dressed with the kind of tape and gauze work that said there hadn't been time or tools for anything better. Pulaski was moving under his own power but favoring his left leg. Garrett was last out, and he stood beside the vehicle for a moment after dismounting and looked at the base around him with a particular expression of someone recalibrating what normal felt like. They were all alive. That was the number that mattered. The base had gathered without being told to. Word moved fast in an enclosed place, and the drone feed had been visible on the operations building monitor to anyone who came through the door in the last 2 hours, which had been most of the base. People stood near the motor pool, near the operations building steps, not quite a formation and not quite a crowd, just present, waiting to see them come back. Briggs got out of the vehicle and stood in the gravel for a moment. He looked like a man who had been behind cover for 6 hours and knew it. Dusty, drawn, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body had been running on threat response for too long and was now beginning to present the bill. He looked at the people gathered and nodded once, which was his version of acknowledgement. Then he looked at Holloway. Holloway was standing at the edge of the motor pool with his arms at his sides and his expression at its usual resting state, which was to say, unreadable but attentive. He held Briggs's look for a moment. Then he looked past him, toward the northern perimeter. Briggs turned to follow the look. Elena was coming through the gate. She had come down the ridgeline the same way she'd gone up. Without announcement, without escort. The gate guard had logged her return at 1341, 6 minutes before the QRF convoy. She was carrying her rifle case and her kit, and she was moving across the gravel in the same unhurried, ground-covering way she always moved. Her uniform was dusty from the climb. There was a small cut on her left hand from the shale, which she hadn't bothered to cover. Her face was wind-burned across the cheekbones in the way that high elevation in dry air produced after a few hours of exposure. She walked past the gathered crowd without looking at them, past the vehicles, past Briggs, who was standing very still and watching her approach and then pass with an expression that had not yet resolved itself into anything identifiable. She went to the armory, checked in her rifle, signed the log, and came back out. Holloway was waiting for her outside the armory door. "My office," he said. 10 minutes. "Yes, Master Sergeant." He walked away. She looked briefly at the assembled group near the motor pool, at Briggs, at Garrett, at the others. And then she went to clean up. Holloway's office was a prefab room with a metal desk, 2 chairs, a wall-mounted whiteboard with a route map still on it from a previous brief, and a window that looked out over the eastern range. He had the file on the desk when she came in. Not open, just present. A manila folder with a classification cover sheet that had been signed and dated in 2 places. She sat in the chair across from him without being asked. He looked at her for a moment. Not the assessing look of someone forming a first impression. That window had closed. This was something different. The look of someone who had confirmed what he suspected and was now deciding how to handle what came with the confirmation. "You know I pulled your file when you got here," he said. "I assumed you would. Most of it I expected. Deployment history, ISR attachment, precision shooter qualification." He paused. "Some of it I didn't expect." She waited. "The record from your previous unit. The verified shot at..." He looked at the file, though she got the impression he wasn't reading it, just giving the number a moment of air. 2,040 meters, which was, at the time of logging, the longest confirmed kill in your unit's operational history. She said nothing. "That record is 2 years old," Holloway said, "which means you've had 2 years to get better." Still nothing. He closed the folder. "I'm going to read something to the unit this afternoon. I don't do this often. I want you to be there, but I'm not going to ask your permission because it's not about permission. It's about what they need to understand." He held her eyes. "Is that going to be a problem?" Elena looked at him for a moment. "No, Master Sergeant." He nodded once. "Get some food. 1600 main briefing room." She ate alone, same as always. The chow hall was quieter than usual. The return team was being seen by the medic, and the rest of the base was in that particular post-incident suspension where normal activity felt slightly unreal. A few people glanced at her. She didn't look up. Garrett came in halfway through her meal and sat down across from her without asking. She looked at him briefly, then back at her food. He didn't say anything for a while, just ate. Then, without preamble, "How long were you up there before you fired?" She considered the question. 43 minutes from leaving the wire to first shot. He did the math on that. The climb alone was brutal, the setup time on top of it, the calculation required before the first trigger pull. "We didn't know you'd gone," he said. "Nobody told us you were up there. When those shots came in..." He stopped. "We didn't know what was happening at first. We thought it was another element. Command support, something." He paused. "It wasn't until we were in the vehicles and Holloway radioed that he told Briggs who'd taken the positions." Elena drank her coffee. "What did Briggs say?" she asked. Garrett was quiet for a second. He didn't say anything for a while. Just looked out the window. She nodded slightly, as if this were the expected answer, and went back to eating. Garrett looked at his tray. "For what it's worth," he said, "I clocked that range on the 3rd position from the drone data when we got back." He paused. 2,114 meters. 2,112, she said, without looking up. "The drone's positional data runs 2 meters long at that altitude. Instrument error." Garrett stared at her. She finished her coffee and picked up her tray. The briefing room held 31 people at 1600, which was essentially the entire base minus the perimeter watch rotation. Briggs was there, seated near the front with Okafor and Pulaski, and the rest of the returned team. His eye cut had been properly closed with 3 strips of medical tape. He was sitting straight, arms on his knees, looking at the front of the room with the expression of a man who had decided to be present and was keeping that decision by effort rather than ease. Elena was at the back, standing, not sitting. She'd taken a position against the rear wall with her arms at her sides and her face neutral. A few people looked at her when they came in. Nobody said anything. Holloway came in last, which was unusual. He normally arrived first. He walked to the front of the room without preamble, stood behind the desk without sitting at it, and placed the open file in front of him. He looked at the room for a moment. "I don't give speeches," he said. "Most of you know that, so this won't be one." The room was very quiet. Sergeant Elena Vasquez was transferred to this unit 6 days ago from an ISR-attached precision element operating overseas. He looked at the file. Her previous team was 12 people. They were conducting an extended observation operation in denied territory when their position was compromised. He paused. The team was engaged by a numerically superior force in a prepared ambush. Over a period of approximately 6 hours, Sergeant Vasquez provided covering fire, coordinated the movement of wounded personnel, and maintained radio contact with command under sustained direct fire. Nobody in the room moved. At the end of those 6 hours, the position was overrun. Sergeant Vasquez was the last person to extract, on foot, under fire, carrying a wounded teammate for approximately 400 meters to the extraction point. He looked up from the file. She was the only member of her element to survive. Not because she ran, because she was the last one out. The words landed in the room and stayed there. Holloway let them sit for a moment. "The nickname that has been circulating on this base since her arrival," he said, and his voice did not change in volume or temperature, but something in it became very direct, was based on the assumption that she survived because she failed. "I want to be precise about what the record actually says." He looked at the file one more time. "It says she survived because she refused to leave until there was no one left to bring out." He closed the file. This unit also assumed, based on a qualification range performance 6 days ago, that Sergeant Vasquez is an average precision shooter. He looked at the room. Her verified long-range record from her previous unit stands at 2,040 meters confirmed. As of this morning, that number has been revised. He picked up a notepad from the desk, his own notes, not the file. "The third enemy position neutralized during today's extraction operation was ranged by drone positional data at 2,114 meters. Instrument-adjusted range, per the shooter, is 2,112. He set the notepad down. "That is not a base record," he said. "That is not a unit record. I'm going to make some calls this evening to determine what record it is, but I want this room to understand the context before I do that." He looked at the file one more time. Then he looked up. "She is not a replacement. She is not a transfer nobody wanted. She is the most capable precision asset this base has had, and she will be treated accordingly, starting now." His eyes moved across the room and settled briefly on Briggs before moving on. "Any questions?" There were none. "Dismissed." The room emptied slowly, which was itself unusual. Normally, a dismissal produced immediate movement. People stood for a moment, shifted, gathered themselves. A few looked at Elena on their way out. Not the way they had looked at her in the chow hall, not with the sideways assessment of someone cataloging an unknown quantity. Something else. Something that had to recalibrate on the way from one end of the room to the other. Briggs was one of the last to leave. He walked toward the door and he passed Elena on the way. He stopped. She looked at him directly, the same way she looked at everything, without performance, without anticipation, simply present. He held her eyes for a moment. There was no speech in him. Whatever he might have said, whatever the words were that sat between what he'd assumed 6 days ago and what he knew now, he couldn't locate them in a form that felt adequate. So he didn't try. He gave her a single nod, the kind that carried weight, the kind that meant something specific between people who understood what it cost. She returned it. He walked out. The eastern range was empty at 1800. The light had dropped to the long, flat gold of late afternoon, casting shadows that made the terrain look deeper than it was. The steel targets at 200, 400, and 600 meters caught the light and threw it back in dull flickers. Elena had her rifle on the bench. She wasn't shooting. She was running a cleaning patch through the barrel with the slow, even strokes of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing else that needed doing right now. The suppressor was off and beside her. The turrets were capped. Garrett appeared at the edge of the range and stopped when he saw her. He started to back off. "You can come in," she said, without looking up. He came and sat on the bench at the next lane over. He watched her work for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said, "I never used the nickname." "I know," she said. "I noticed." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you do that? Notice everything, I mean. It's like you're always—" He searched for the word. "Watching," she said. "Yeah." She ran another patch through, examined the tip, set it aside. "When you've been in a position where not watching costs you people," she said, "you stop being able to turn it off." He didn't have an answer to that. He sat with it instead, which was the right thing to do. After a while, he said, "What was their names? Your team?" She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. "I know their names," she said. "I don't need to say them to remember them." She seated the bolt, raised the rifle briefly to check the action, then set it down and began reassembling the suppressor. The range was quiet except for the wind off the hills and the small, precise sounds of her hands on the metal. The light kept dropping. The targets at 600 meters caught one last glint and went dark as the sun moved behind the ridge. The same ridge. She looked at it for a moment. Just a ridge. Rock and shale and bad footing and a view that went forever in every direction on a clear morning. She looked back at her rifle. She kept working.